has been a spate of excitement recently over the Shemitah Rapture theory, which claims that the tribulation could begin this fall on the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, which is September 26th, and that implies that the rapture would have to happen before that time, probably in the next few weeks, 4 or 5 weeks. This theory is corroborated by a pattern of memorable events that have happened over the centuries that either have directly or indirectly affected the Jews. These things have happened either in a Shemitah year, which is the 7th year of a Shemitah cycle, or they've happened in the first year of the following Shemitah cycle. Now, is this rapture theory true? Will the rapture happen this fall? Or is the Shemitah theory based on theological and methodological missteps? Stay tuned. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, particularly truth in the prophetic arena, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Today we're going to look at the Shemitah Rapture theory, and we're going to start with an overview of the Shemitah Rapture theory. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of any particular presentation of the theory by any particular man, simply because I want to focus on the core generic points. I don't want to get caught up mentioning men's names and going into all these little abstruse details. I just want to hit the critical core points. So the theory in general has 5 main points. The first point is that the 7-year Shemitah cycle is more than a Jewish cycle for specific Jewish purposes. It's a universal cycle that began at creation. Point 2 is that the history of the world can be divided into 1,000 7-year Shemitah cycles that began at creation and will end at the end of the millennium. The third point is that these cycles are governed by the Jewish calendar but not by the Gregorian calendar. Each year begins on the 1st of Tishri and ends on the 29th of Elul. In other words, the year change is going to happen every year in either September or October on the Gregorian calendar. The fourth point is that when Israel observed the Shemitah cycle in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan, their implementation exactly corresponded with the already existing Shemitah week cycle that started in creation. They overlapped or overlaid exactly, precisely. And the fifth point is that the 70 weeks pronounced in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 upon Israel and Judah are an exact number of back-to-back Shemitah weeks, and they overlay precisely over the universal Shemitah cycle that started in creation. So in this theory, the 69 weeks are 69 exact Shemitah weeks back-to-back. The time between the 69th week and the 70th week, the church age, is an exact number of back-to-back Shemitah weeks. The 70th week is a Shemitah week that overlays perfectly with this universal Shemitah cycle. And because it's a Shemitah week, the 70th week is a Shemitah week, that means that the tribulation can only begin on the first day of a new Shemitah cycle. And since the tribulation is a Shemitah week, that means the kingdom or the millennium is also going to begin with a new Shemitah cycle. So that's the 5 points. Now, when you apply this cycle, it has some fascinating ramifications. We are currently in the 7th year of a Shemitah cycle, which began last year on the 1st of Tishri, which would be September 7th, 2021. And it's going to end this year on the 29th of Elul, which is September 25th, 2022. The 1st of Tishri, September 26th, is the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, and that is the suspected beginning of the tribulation. If the tribulation doesn't start on Rosh Hashanah this year, it can't start again until the fall of 2029. In other words, if the rapture doesn't happen this fall, we reset and wait for the fall of 2029 to be expecting the rapture shortly prior to the beginning of the tribulation. Now, I want to point out that there's a lot of interesting corroborations to this theory. Many men have made numerous lists of amazing things that have happened on either the Shemitah year, which is the last year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, or they've happened on the first year of the new Shemitah cycle. In the minds of those that have handled this material, these events happening on the Shemitah year or in the first year of the new cycle strengthen the claim that we can expect the tribulation to happen in the near future based on the Shemitah cycle. Maybe this coming September. Now, this is a very fascinating theory. I've enjoyed studying it. I've enjoyed looking at it. And personally, I greatly respect and admire many of the men that have written on this subject. However, the Shemitah Rapture theory breaks down on 5 critical points. And we're going to look into these points now. I want to start out by telling you that I could spend hours going through tedious details from numerous teachers of this theory, showing how they've treated the math and the charts and the dates and the chronological data like it was silly putty, and they have no problem rounding numbers up or rounding numbers down so they can match their charts. They have no problem fudging numbers or fudging dates and ignoring facts. But I don't want to descend in all the tedious details. Most of you, it would go over your heads for a lot of you. You'd just be swimming in information. You'd be drowning in information. So I'm going to limit my treatment to the 5 generic observations that are not teacher specific. And these failures are seen in greater or lesser degree in every one of the Shemitah Rapture presentations that I have examined. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to take this route for 2 reasons. First of all, I don't like mentioning names unless it's absolutely necessary. And secondly, I don't want people to get lost in a sea of minor details. I want them to see and understand the major failures of the Shemitah Rapture theory. And that's where I'm going to direct their attention. And I'm going to demonstrate, and you're going to understand when I'm done, that the Shemitah Rapture theory is based on a string of assumptions that would have been rejected if men had rigorously tested this theory in the crucible of facts and history and chronological science and common sense. So, the failure number 1 is the unfounded expansion of the biblical Shemitah cycle. Now, this cycle is found in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 through 5. It's also found in Leviticus 25, verses 20 through 21. And it's found in Exodus 23, verses 10 through 11. So let's read Leviticus 25, 1 through 5. And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. That which grows of its own accord in your harvest you shall not reap, neither gather the grapes of your undressed vine, for it is a year of rest unto the land. Now I want you to notice that there are 3 identifying characteristics of God's Shemitah cycle which he gave to Israel. The first one is that it's given to the nation of Israel as the people of God. It's part of their law. The second thing is that it applies when Israel is in the land, when you come into the land. And the third thing you need to observe is that this is an agricultural cycle. 6 years they're going to work their fields, and the 7th year is a Sabbath rest for the field. Now, I want you to notice that in these passages, which are the passages that address the Shemitah cycle, there is zero evidence that Israel observed the Shemitah cycle in the wilderness. There is zero evidence that Israel was commanded to observe the Shemitah cycle in the wilderness. There is zero evidence that Israel was expected to observe the Shemitah cycle in the wilderness. In fact, there is zero evidence that the Shemitah cycle applied to any nation on earth except for Israel. Although the principle of letting your land lay fallow or at rest every seventh year is actually a pretty smart idea. There's zero evidence that the Shemitah cycle pertained to anything except the agricultural cycle. And there is zero evidence that the Shemitah cycle pertained to any circumstance except when Israel was in her promised land. I want you to observe the contrast between God's handling of the seventh-day Sabbath and God's handling of the seventh-year Sabbath. For instance, God upheld the seventh-day Sabbath in the wilderness with severe threats and severe punishments. For instance, we see the warning in Exodus 31:15. 6 days may work be done, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely put to death. That's the warning. That's the threat. Now we see the punishment or the exacting of this threat in Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. And there we read, "They found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day," skip a little bit, "brought him to Moses and Aaron," skip a little bit, "put him in the ward," skip a little bit, "and the Lord said unto Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside or without the camp." So notice, God rigorously enforced the seventh-day Sabbath when they were in the wilderness. But you can read through all of the account of the wilderness, whether in the historical books or in the memories in the book of Psalms or anywhere else, you are not going to find God threatening and warning about not keeping the seventh-year Sabbath in the wilderness. And you're not going to find anything on him exacting punishment over the seventh-year Sabbath in the wilderness. There's no hint of the seventh-year Sabbath being commanded in the wilderness journey or for the wilderness journey. There's no threats issued. There's no punishments meted out. This is telling. God gave the entirety of the law to Israel in the wilderness, and he especially emphasized the seventh-day Sabbath, which was instituted in the garden. So the fact that the seventh-year Sabbath wasn't enforced implies that it's not a universal principle for Israel, much less a universal principle from the garden for entirety of mankind. So now the evidence that we've just looked at boils down to two fatal bullets. Fatal bullet number one: if the Shemitah cycle was limited to the agricultural cycles of Israel when Israel was in the land, then it can't be a universal cycle that was universally applied and required and observed by God. And fatal bullet number two: if the Shemitah cycle wasn't enforced by God in the wilderness, then it can't be a universal cycle that was universally enforced by God from creation. Well, let's look at failure number two, which is disjoining the Shemitah cycle from the Jubilee. Now, the Jubilee is taught in Leviticus 25, verses 8 through 11, and it's taught in Numbers 36, verse 4. Let's read Leviticus 25, 8 through 11. "And you shall number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you, 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and you shall return every man unto his possession, and you shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee in that 50th year shall be unto you. You shall not sow, neither reap that which grows of itself in your fields, nor gather the grapes of your undressed vine. Notice the biblical cycle. The above passage, read without any preconceived ideas, indicates that the Jubilee is an independent 50th year that follows the 49-year grand Shemitah cycle. You have 7 Shemitah cycles of 7 years, plus an independent Jubilee year. This is a 50-year cycle. Now, the 50-year cycle was broken. According to ancient Jewish traditions, Israel quit counting the Jubilee after the Assyrian captivity around 733 BC. And they began counting by 49s, that is, 7 Shemitah cycles. Their justification was that Israel was not in the land. Now, this 49-year count has continued to the present day unbroken. In fact, we have a reference to the Shemitah year in Josephus, which indicates that the Shemitah cycle being observed by the Jews today is the same one that was observed in Josephus's day, and he indicated that it had been observed going into the past. But now when it comes to the counting these Shemitah cycles in our day, many have kind of regressed away from counting a 50-year cycle and counting a 49-year cycle, and they're simply counting back-to-back 7-year simple Shemitah cycles. They're paying very little regard to the 49-year cycle, and they're paying no regard to the 50-year Jubilee cycle. Now I want to point out here that if God intended for men to be keeping 50-year cycles that included a 49-year grand Shemitah cycle and an independent 50th year Jubilee, and men are counting 49-year Jubilee cycles or 49-year Shemitah cycles, or they're counting back-to-back Shemitah cycles that are 7 years long, then they are not following God's Shemitah cycle. Now, men give 2 arguments for observing a 49-year Shemitah cycle or a 49-year Jubilee cycle instead of the 50-year Shemitah plus Jubilee cycle. The first argument they give is inclusive counting. They claim that the 50th year Jubilee isn't an additional year added to the 49 years, but it's simply the first year of the following 49-year grand Shemitah cycle. Now, inclusive counting is critical for the Shemitah Rapture theory. The Shemitah Rapture theory requires that the 69 weeks in Daniel, along with all the church age weeks, and the 70th week of Daniel are back-to-back simple Shemitah cycle weeks that are not broken up anywhere along the line by the addition of a 50th year Jubilee. If you throw in the 50th year Jubilee, you completely throw off the Shemitah Rapture theory. But folks, inclusive counting of the 50th year Jubilee is unbiblical. Leviticus 25 verses 3 through 4 plainly states, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in the fruit thereof. But the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Did you notice? The language here absolutely requires an independent 50th year Jubilee, and it absolutely forbids inclusive counting of the Jubilee. Notice, the same law that requires rest on the 7th year also requires work for 6 years, 6 full years. If the Jubilee is celebrated in the first year of a new Shemitah cycle immediately following the 49-year Shemitah cycle, then you only have 5 years between the Jubilee Sabbath and the following Shemitah year Sabbath. And this is contrary to Scripture. Remember, Scripture requires the 6 years of work just as much as it requires the 7th year Sabbath or the 7th year rest. As the 6 days of work is sacred and just as sacred as the 7th day of rest, so the 6 years of working the fields and vines is just as sacred as the 7th year of rest. Now, the second reason that people give for teaching inclusive counting for the Jubilee year instead of having an intercalated year or an additional year is they claim that back-to-back Sabbath seems unreasonable and unmanageable. The Lord promised harvest sufficient, they say, for the Sabbath year or the Shemitah year. He didn't promise sufficient harvest for 2 back-to-back Sabbath years. The normal Sabbath plus the extra Jubilee Sabbath. So it's just a stretch to add the 50th year. However, folks, the Bible addresses this very question in the Jubilee passage. Let's turn to Leviticus chapter 25 and verses 20 through 21. And if you shall say, what shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow, nor gather in our increase. And the Lord replies, then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. Did you catch that? They're told not to worry about the Sabbath years. God will provide 3 years worth of harvest in the 6th year. This suffices for the 7th year in every normal Shemitah cycle. And it suffices for the Jubilee year. And it suffices for the first year after the Jubilee year when you've got all that time you have to wait until the harvest. So in conclusion, the clear teaching of Scripture requires a distinct 50th year Jubilee following a grand Shemitah cycle of 49 years. And the arguments for a 49-year Jubilee cycle with inclusive counting are without foundation, and they're answered by clear statements of the Bible. So folks, if you are not counting the Shemitah cycles in grand cycles of 49 with an independent 50th year Jubilee, then you are not counting the Shemitah cycles according to God's pattern. You're just following the way the Jews have been doing it since they walked away from God's pattern after the Assyrian captivity. So let's look at the third failure. And that is that the universal Shemitah cycle theory is at hopeless odds with the Bible's 7 millennia division of history. The Bible divides history into 7 1,000-year-long figurative days. A 7 millennia Sabbath cycle that is parallel to the 7-day Sabbath cycle. In this cycle, there's 4,000 years from creation to the cross. There's 2,000 years from the cross to the kingdom, and there's 1,000 years in the kingdom. Now, there's 3 primary passages that present this 1,000-year figurative day pattern. The foundation pattern is found in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. And it's given in the context of patiently waiting for the day of the Lord. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. The basic principle here is that the age is divided into 1,000-year-long figurative days, and these days are going to help us reckon the approximate time of the coming of the day of the Lord in the kingdom. Because this whole passage is concerned about when the day of the Lord is going to come. And this gives us God's pattern so that we can approximate the time of the coming of the day of the Lord, just like in the Old Testament, men were given the math that they could calculate the approximate time of the coming of the Messiah. Now, the primary application passage for this pattern is found in Hosea chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he is torn, and he will heal us. He is smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. In the third day he shall raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. So notice, there's 2,000 years from the cross where God set aside the temple in Israel and turned to the church. So there's 2,000 years from the cross to the kingdom. And there's 1,000 years in the kingdom. Now, another strong application passage is found in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And I'm just going to give you a few highlights, skipping or skimming through this passage. A promise being left to us of entering into his rest. For we which have believed do enter into that rest, the seventh day. There remains therefore a rest to the people of God. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest. This corroborates the concept of 1,000-year-long or the millennial rest. And notice that there is a Sabbath rest coming for the people of God. This is not the rest of faith which we can enjoy during the pilgrim journey. This is the rest of reward that we enjoy after the time of our journey in the wilderness of this world. Notice the command to labor to enter into this rest proves that this is not talking about the rest that we can enjoy right now in the finished work of Christ while we're wandering in this wilderness. Now, folks, this cycle of 7 1,000-year figurative days is God's 7 cycle for the history of the world. Not 1,007s, but 7 1,000s. There is exactly 6,000 years from the first day of creation to the day prior to the second coming. There's not 2 years longer. There's not 2 years shorter. There's not 1 week or day longer. There's not 1 week or day shorter. And any discrepancies in our chronology need to be adjusted to fit this 6,000-year, 7,000-year pattern. And just as there's no tampering with the 7-day Sabbath cycle, which is the week, or with Israel's 7-year Shemitah cycle, so there's no tampering with the 7 millennia cycle. Now, when you overlay the 7 millennia cycle over the supposed universal Shemitah cycle, the suggested dates for the tribulation and the kingdom do not line up. Remember, there's exactly 2,000 years from the cross to the kingdom. At the cross, the veil in the temple was rent and Israel was set aside. After 2 days, he will revive us, and in the third day, he will raise us up. Now, the Shemitah Rapture advocates, on the basis of the theory that the tribulation starts on the first year of a new Shemitah cycle, postulate 2022, this fall, for the beginning of the tribulation, and 2029 in the fall for the beginning of the millennium. And if this doesn't pan out, then they offer 2029 in the fall for the beginning of the tribulation, and 2036 for the beginning of the millennium. But these dates don't mesh with the dates that are suggested by God's 1,000-year figurative days cycle. No matter what halfway reasonable dates we accept for the cross, and I mean dates that we arrive at by using chronological science, the dates don't align with the Shemitah cycle rapture theory dates. If we use 30 AD for the cross, then we have a 2023 tribulation and a 2030 kingdom. If we use 31 AD for the cross, then we have a 2024 tribulation and a 2031 kingdom. If we use 32 AD for the cross, then we have a 2025 tribulation and a 2032 kingdom. And if we use 33 AD for the cross, we have a 2026 tribulation and a 2033 kingdom. So you can see that a 2022 tribulation and a 2029 millennium are too early. And a 2029 tribulation and a 2036 millennium are too late. So in conclusion, if the Shemitah Rapture theory is true, then the 7 millennia pattern of the Bible is false. And if the 7 millennia pattern of the Bible is true, then the Shemitah Rapture theory is false. They can't both be true. Furthermore, the Shemitah cycles divorced from the 50th year Jubilee are at hopeless odds with God's 7 millennia Sabbath cycle. 1,000 is not divisible by 7. And this is right at the heart of why the Shemitah cycles were supposed to be counted in grand cycles of 7 sevens, a total of 49, followed by an independent 50th year Jubilee. But God's 50th year Jubilee cycle, which includes 7 7-year Shemitah cycles plus a 50th year Jubilee, perfectly harmonizes with God's 1,000-year-long figurative day cycle. And folks, this cycle, which should have been used all along since God gave the Shemitah cycle with the Jubilee to Israel, is going to be the one used in the millennium. Well, let's look at failure number 4, which is the fact that Daniel's 70 weeks don't harmonize with the Shemitah cycle weeks. Let's start by looking at the Bible's teaching on Daniel's 70 weeks. In Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, we read, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Notice that there's 69 weeks from Artaxerxes' decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, including the walls, to Messiah the King. And notice also that there's no hint that these weeks are agricultural weeks or generic time-counting weeks. The only information that we have here indicates that these weeks are specifically designed to be for the judgment and purification of Israel. They're specifically geared to the nation of Israel. Now, let's quickly review the Shemitah Rapture theory in general. The 69 weeks and the 70th week, the Tribulation, are precise Shemitah weeks. The first 69 weeks are back-to-back Shemitah weeks. The church window, or the parenthesis of the church age, between the 69th week and the 70th week is composed of back-to-back precise Shemitah cycle weeks. And the 70th week itself is a Shemitah week. And the kingdom starts with the Shemitah week. But now we have problems with this theory. We've already seen that the 70th week, that is the tribulation, when calculated by the Shemitah Rapture theory, doesn't harmonize or precisely overlay with the 70th week or the tribulation when calculated by the Bible's 7 millennia Sabbath cycle. And of course, we're assuming that we're calculating with cross years that are halfway reasonable by purely scientific chronological considerations, which means that we've got only for options 30, 31, 32, and 33 AD. But the Shemitah Rapture theory also breaks down when it comes to the calculation of the 69 weeks from Artaxerxes' decree to Messiah the Prince. Now, the Shemitah Rapture theory is facing 4 problems here when it comes to the 69 weeks. The first one is just general sloppiness. In the Bible, there's 69 weeks of years from Artaxerxes' command to Messiah the King. There's not a year more or less. There's not a month more or less. There's not a week more or less. It's exactly 69 weeks of years. Now, in theory, the Shemitah Rapture theory is counting 69 Shemitah cycles from Artaxerxes' decree to Messiah the King. They're not merely counting 483 years, 69 weeks of years. They're counting 69 precise Shemitah weeks. They're starting, and this means that they're starting from the first day of the first year of the first Shemitah cycle all the way to the last day of the last year of the 69th Shemitah cycle. But their practice differs widely from the theory. The Shemitah Rapture theory actually counts more than 483 years, more than 69 Shemitah cycles, between the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem and the appearance of Messiah the King, or the fulfillment of Messiah the King. Notice in their theory that the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem is issued in a Shemitah year. There's typically regarded as 458 to 457 BC, which is the year prior to the first year of the first Shemitah cycle, which is 457 to 456 BC. Notice further that Messiah the King is usually located in either the close of the 69th Shemitah cycle, which is year 26-27, or during the first year of the next Shemitah cycle, which is year 27 to 28. And this associates Messiah the King with Christ's baptism and the start of his ministry. However, there's a lot of slop surrounding the command date and the Messiah the King date. And this yields a span that could vary much longer than the 69 Shemitah weeks. This could be anywhere from a few extra weeks to 2 years or more, depending upon where the command date is actually lands in comparison to the beginning of that first year of the 69 Shemitah weeks, the first day of the first year of the 69 Shemitah weeks. And there's a lot of slop on the other end where we come to the last day of the last year, or the Shemitah year of the 69th Shemitah week, in its relationship to where Christ was actually baptized. So again, this could vary anywhere from a few weeks to a year or more to a couple years off. So folks, 484 years or 485 years are not 483 years or 69 weeks of years, much less 69 precise Shemitah weeks. Now we're facing a conundrum here. If the 69 weeks of Daniel are 69 Shemitah weeks, then the command must go out on the first day of the first Shemitah cycle, and the Messiah, the King prophecy, must be fulfilled on the last day of the last year of the 69th Shemitah cycle. And if the command went out on any day before or after the first day of the first year of the first Shemitah cycle, and Messiah the King was fulfilled on any day before or after the last day of the last year of the 69th Shemitah cycle, then the 69 weeks of Daniel are not Shemitah weeks. Now we face a second problem if we're attempting to equate the 69 weeks in Daniel with 69 precise Shemitah weeks, and that is the fact that the terminus a quo is wrong. In other words, the point from which the 69 weeks are measured is wrong. The Shemitah Rapture theory regards the decree of Artaxerxes in his 7th year, which is 587 BC, as the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. They do this because it conveniently falls in a Shemitah year that appears to fit their Shemitah treatment of the 69 weeks. But a problem arises if we go to the scriptures to validate this theory. This decree, recorded in Ezra 7, sends Ezra to Jerusalem for the restoration of the temple. In this passage, we see the temple and the things of the temple mentioned over and over again. We see the altar, we see sacrifices, we see priests, we see the Levites, the Nethinim, and the sacrifices, and the gold and the silver. But no mention is made of the restoration of the city, much less the restoration or the rebuilding of the walls and the gates. However, Artaxerxes' second decree, issued in his 20th year, which we see in Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2, commissioned Nehemiah to rebuild the walls and to restore the gates. Indeed, this is the only decree in Scripture that specifically mentions the city walls and its fortifications like the gates. Nehemiah's chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 actually records the building of the walls and the restoration of the gates. So if we're going to let simple exegesis of the Scriptures decide the matter rather than a cool-sounding theory, the only decree that can be considered as the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, with special regard to rebuilding the walls, is the decree issued by Artaxerxes in his 20th year. It addressed this matter specifically, and it saw this matter completed the very same year that Nehemiah was commissioned and sent. Now, the theory that the 69 weeks in Daniel, or 69 precise Shemitah weeks, has a third problem, and that is that the terminus ad quem is incorrect. In other words, the point at which the 69 weeks are supposed to end. Remember that the language of Scripture requires us to measure from the command to rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince. We read, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, the Shemitah Rapture theory measures this span from the command to restore the temple in Artaxerxes' 7th year to Christ's baptism around 27 or 28 AD. But we have already seen that the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem can only be the command that was issued in the month Nisan in Artaxerxes' 20th year. This means that Christ's baptism can't be what is meant by Messiah the King. Because if you count from the decree in Artaxerxes' 20th year, and you're going to use 69 Shemitah weeks, you're going to run way past not just Christ's baptism, you're going to run way past his ministry, you're going to run way past the cross, and you're going to end up out there 38, 39, 40 AD. So we're going to have to look somewhere else for what is meant by Messiah the King. Happily, the Scriptures point to the fulfillment of Messiah the King with great clarity. For those with an ear to hear in the matter, they point to the triumphant entry. Let me just read the passages. Let's start with the prophecy given in Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy King cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, and riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Now, we find the fulfillment in Luke chapter 19, verses 37 and 38. Then the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice, drop down a little bit, saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. We find the fulfillment also in John chapter 12, verses 12 through 15. Many people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of the palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried, Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that cometh in the name of the Lord. And Jesus, when he had found a young ass, sat thereon, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, thy King cometh, sitting on an ass's colt. Now, the public embraced him here as a king, though this proved to be a fickle matter. But the disciples, after Jesus' resurrection, realized that this was the fulfillment of God's prophetic word in Zechariah. Now, there's a fourth problem that you face if you're trying to equate the 69 weeks in Daniel with the 69 precise Shemitah weeks. And that problem is that you're using the wrong year length for counting the weeks. The Shemitah Rapture theory uses the current 365.25 day year to calculate the 69 weeks. They do this because their theory that the 70 weeks are Shemitah weeks absolutely necessitates that the years be our current 365.25 day years. And this commitment to this restricts them from the decree in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which was around 445 or 440 BC, and requires them to back up to the decree in his 7th year, which is around 457 BC. And they're restricted from the 20th year because if you measure 69 weeks of normal years, or 483 years, from the decree in 444 or 445 BC, you're going to go way past the cross. You're going to end up out there in 39 or 40 AD. So, commitment to using 69 Shemitah weeks for the 69 weeks of Daniel forces them to do two things. It forces them to embrace the temple decree in the 7th year of Artaxerxes as the command to rebuild and restore the city, rather than the city and the wall decree, which was given in Artaxerxes' 20th year. And it forces them to look to Christ's baptism in AD 27 or 28 as Messiah the King, rather than his triumphant entry in the vicinity of AD 32 or 33, when he actually was pronounced the coming king. And as a matter of fact, God gave us his year-length pattern when he used the 360-day year for the 70th week of Daniel in the book of Revelation. And if we're going to be consistent, consistency demands that the 69 weeks and the 70th week use the same year length. Now, some complain that it seems quirky to use a complicated 360-day year counting system when you can use the plain year counting system. But I can flip the tables on them here. To me, it seems odd to use the plain year counting when God himself used the complicated 360-day year counting. And furthermore, using two different counting systems for the 70 weeks, using a 365.25 day year for counting the 69 weeks, and then using a 360-day year for counting the 70th week, this seems to me much more problematic than simply using a 360-day year throughout the entire 70 weeks. Furthermore, the 360-day year count comes out to exactly 483 years. 173,880 days. When you measure from the very day of Artaxerxes' decree in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, and measure to the very day of the triumphant entry. Men who are very astute in the word have calculated this for both 444 BC to AD 33, and they've done it for 445 BC to AD 32. Personally, I vastly prefer the complicated counting that starts from the exact day of the right decree and goes to the exact day of the right event over the plain counting that starts with the wrong decree and goes to the wrong event and has sloppiness on both ends. What do you think? Now, there's a reason for the 360-day year being used. Folks, the 360-day year is the original length of the year, and it's going to be the length of the year in the millennium after the curse is removed. Let me tell you a story here. When I was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, it dawned on me that the current length of the year, 365.25 days, had to be part of the curse. It couldn't be God's original plan. And that the original length of the year had to be 360 days that was divided by 12 lunar months that were exactly 30 days long each, not a minute too long, not a minute too short. And this perfectly harmonizes the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. I based this decision when I had almost no knowledge of the Word of God, just simply on a generic thinking on the character and reasonability of God. Now, fast forwards deeper into my adult life, and my studies in ancient history and in the Bible revealed that indeed the original length of the year was 360 days. This is the length of the year that we see in Genesis in the account of the flood. This is the length of the year that we see all over in ancient history. So my suspicions from when I was a child, without any deep knowledge of the Bible, was confirmed by the knowledge of the Bible and by actual history. Now, in history, the Assyrian captivity happened around 733 BC. And a few decades later, the sundial retreated 10 degrees around 701 BC in Hezekiah's reign. This was 5 days on a 360-degree annual sundial, not 1.25 hours on a daily sundial. This was not a little jolt to the timekeeping of the ancient world. This was a massive jolt to the timekeeping of the ancient world. It was such a massive jolt that ambassadors were sent from Babylon to Israel to inquire about the wonder that happened in the land. You see this in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 31. Apparently the story had spread that the change had happened because Hezekiah the king had prayed and God had answered his prayer. And in this same time frame, Solon, one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, received the equivalent of a Nobel Prize for calculating the new length of the day at 365.25 days. And I think that this change in the year length is the reason for all the Stonehenge structures that we see around the globe. Simple counting no longer worked. They had to figure out the new length of the day. They had to figure out the new length of the year. They had to figure out the new summer solstice and winter solstice and spring equinox and fall equinox and where they're going to put their feast days. Now, at the time of the kingdom, the year is going to return to 360-day year, and the captivity of Israel is going to be returned. And there's a chiasmus here. This chiasmus starts with Israel's captivity around 733 BC with the Assyrian captivity, and then we have the year corrupted, and then we have the year restored, and then we have captivity restored. So captivity, year corrupted, year restored, captivity restored. So the use of the 360-day year calendar for the 70th week, or for the 70th week and the 69 weeks, so for all 70 weeks, it's a conscience-probing effort of the Lord to remind Israel of the curse that the world is under, and the judgment that they're under, and of the coming blessings in the kingdom. It's a reminder to them of the current disharmony in nature and the coming harmony in nature. Now, the fifth and final failure of the Shemitah Rapture theory is that the universal Shemitah cycle doesn't harmonize with creation. The backbone of the Shemitah Rapture theory is the teaching that the Shemitah cycle is a universal timekeeping cycle that traces all the way back to creation. Now, if this theory was true, it would backdate to creation with a pattern that's parallel to the seventh-day Sabbath pattern. As creation started with 6 days of work and 1 day of rest, so creation would have started with the Shemitah cycle, 6 years of work and 1 year of rest. And creation would have occurred on the first year of the cycle. In fact, the first 6 days of that year. The next 5 years would have been foundational work years, and then the 7th year would have been the Shemitah year, or the Shemitah Sabbath rest. Here's the problem. When men make relatively honest efforts to overlay the chronology of the Old Testament and the New Testament on the supposed universal Shemitah cycle calendar, the universal Shemitah cycle doesn't backdate properly to creation. In fact, the most accurate charting of a backdated Shemitah cycle that I have seen has creation in the 7th year of a Shemitah cycle, which they calculated to be 3972 to 3971 BC. Now, this seems pretty cool to have creation land on a Shemitah year, except that it isn't cool. First of all, you can't have a Shemitah year without the preceding 6 years. And secondly, you can't have 6 years prior to creation. And thirdly, God working in a Shemitah Sabbath year is completely contrary to the Shemitah Sabbath principle. The principle is working for 6 years, then letting the land rest for the 7th year. God followed his own principle with the 7th day Sabbath rest. Why wouldn't he follow it with the 7th year Sabbath rest? Folks, any breach of this principle is morally repugnant. The fact is, none of the Shemitah Rapture systems that I examined that made a relatively honest attempt to overlay biblical chronology on a Shemitah cycle chart actually located the creation year in the first year of a Shemitah cycle. They located it in a number of other years, the 5th, the 7th, etc., but not in the first year of the Shemitah cycle. And this is problematic. First of all, if creation started with the Shemitah cycle, then creation occurred in year 1 of the Shemitah cycle. And secondly, if creation occurred in any year of a Shemitah cycle other than the first year, then creation didn't start with the Shemitah cycle. And thirdly, if creation didn't start with 6 years of work before the Shemitah year, then the pattern is broken before it started. There is no Shemitah cycle. And fourthly, if creation actually started with a true blue Shemitah cycle, then the current Shemitah cycle is 6 years off. So let's look at a summary of the 5 failures. The first point is that there is zero evidence that it is legitimate to take Israel's in the land agricultural Sabbath cycle and backdate it to creation and regard it as a redemptive framework for the entire history of the world. The second point is that Israel and now many evangelicals following in their footsteps have divorced the Shemitah cycle from the 50th year Jubilee. The third point is that the universal Shemitah cycle doesn't harmonize with the 1,000-year day cycle. The two can only harmonize when you take a 49-year grand Shemitah cycle and add or append a 50th year Jubilee. The fourth point is that Daniel's 70 weeks don't harmonize with the Shemitah weeks. They don't harmonize with the Shemitah cycle years. The fifth point is that the Shemitah cycle theory doesn't harmonize with creation. So what is the correct 70 weeks position? The 70 weeks are not Shemitah weeks. They are simply 70 weeks of judgment decreed upon Israel to finish their sin and bring in everlasting righteousness. They stem from the same moral principles that prescribe things like the 7th day Sabbath, the 7th millennia Sabbath, and the Shemitah year cycle. But they are not Shemitah years. They are their own distinct 7 system. And what's the correct Shemitah position? When God introduced the Shemitah cycle, he wanted it to be observed in grand cycles of 7 Shemitah cycles, followed by an independent 50th year Jubilee. This harmonizes his Shemitah cycle with his 1,000-year-long figurative day cycle. Furthermore, the Shemitah cycle pertains only to Israel alone and only to agriculture alone and only when Israel is in the promised land of Israel. Thirdly, after the Assyrian captivity, the Jews dropped the 50th year Jubilee and started counting only 49-year Shemitah cycles. And this is how they have counted ever since. But the universal Shemitah cycle with 1,000 back-to-back Shemitah cycles from creation to the end of the kingdom is a theory which has zero biblical merit. Folks, when God set Jerusalem and Israel and the temple and the law aside at the cross, when he rent the veil in the temple, he set everything aside. This includes their Shemitah cycles, whether rightly or wrongly counted. And when the Lord returns and establishes his kingdom, he is not going to continue with the current Jewish Shemitah cycle. He's going to start from scratch with his 50-year Shemitah cycle, that is, 49 years or 7 Shemitah cycles plus independent 50th year Jubilee, and he's going to employ this 50-year cycle right out of the gate. Well, what about the cool coincidences of stuff that's happened on the Shemitah year and on the first year of a new Shemitah cycle? Well, some of these events, folks, were actually chronologically massaged to fit the Shemitah cycle and land on a Shemitah year or on the first year of a new Shemitah cycle. But many of the events actually did land on those years, and that is pretty amazing, to be honest. Now, this amazing pattern, to the degree that it's valid, doesn't prove either the Shemitah Rapture theory or the underlying universal Shemitah cycle theory. Well, what does it prove then? It proves the providence and wisdom of God. We see the fingerprints of God using the Jews' own calendar, though it departed from his calendar, to remind them that they are under judgment. As God has seen fit to have painful tragedies happen to the Jews on Tisha B'Av, on their current Jewish calendar, as a testimony to them, so it seems the Lord has seen fit to have major events that either directly involve Israel or affect Israel happen on either the Shemitah year or the first year of a new Shemitah cycle. And this is merely God meeting his earthly people where they are at, trying to remind them that they are under judgment for their unbelief so that they will be more receptive to the Messiah. In conclusion, the Shemitah Rapture theory sounds cool and racy, but it doesn't have theological legs to stand on. The location of the tribulation and the location of the millennium have nothing to do with the current Jewish Shemitah calendar. To be honest, I think too much attention is being given to things like the Shemitah cycle and the blood moons. I think eternity is going to demonstrate that their value for prophetic understanding and prophetic discernment is relatively insignificant. At any rate, folks, continue to study and continue to think. Learn to use the scriptures mercilessly on every new teaching that makes the rounds. Don't be bamboozled by cool-sounding theories and the latest doctrinal fads. Don't be afraid to use the sword. You can't make the truth bleed. And don't be afraid to balk at sloppiness. Don't be afraid to demand precision. The truth doesn't need wiggle room. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.